Today, this is going to be an exploration into the many different fragments that composers have left behind and the various very interesting attempts to finish them. On screen, you'll see a little sketch for Beethoven's 10th Symphony, which is really the starting point of how these things exist. You know, fragments of music that's been left behind are then taken on either by contemporaries or others. I must confess this is a slightly misleading title. Though it's named Unfinished Symphonies, I will really touch on a variety of musical works. So the first question is, are we really talking about just Schubert here? And the answer is absolutely not. Unfinished works are incredibly widespread. In reality, if you name almost any composer, there will almost certainly be incomplete musical fragments, sketches, things left behind that weren't put to completion. I've got an anecdote to share with you. A few years back, I was finishing my postgrad in London, and I was approached by an elderly gentleman who's quite wealthy, and he collected manuscripts. He bought them at auction, at Sotheby's and things like that. Now, he alone had about 10 to 15 manuscripts, extracts that were basically completely unknown to anyone else. Mainly songs, but by some really serious composers, Elgar, Puccini, and no one had ever played these. No one had even attempted to play them. That's just one person, so you know, who knows what else is out there really. Now, that's not to say that all of these are equally interesting. What really makes works interesting is kind of three factors: how much remains of the sketches. So to what extent is there material there already we can work with? The historical significance. So obviously it's much more interesting to look at Beethoven 10 and Mahler 10 than it is to look at Dussek or someone like that. And then also whether the composer actually intended to complete the work. You know, if there were just a couple of notes, a scribble of a melody, and a composer gave up on it almost immediately, it wouldn't be that interesting. But if there was genuine intention to complete the work, obviously there's something that is worth investigating. So I'm going to focus on some of the best examples in roughly chronological order, and particularly those that have had an attempt at completion. So as we explore, I'd encourage you to look out for the three main ways that these works are completed. They could be by the composer's contemporaries. So these are typically students or other composers with close relationships. Sometimes even the family of composers get involved as to who they think should go and complete the work. It could be by performers or musicologists in the future. That really comes down to clear sketches and materials like that. And then most recently, it could be by technology, artificial intelligence. That brings about some very interesting questions, you know. What is creativity if you can't tell the difference between whether a piece is written by a computer or by a person? I will say that we're still in the early stages of this, but you'll hear some interesting examples later on. So our journey really starts with Bach and the art of the Fugue, which was kind of written in the last decade of Bach's life. Now, this is an incomplete, vast musical work, unspecified instrumentation. You can think of it as kind of like a deep dive into fugal writing. He's really kind of pushing to explore the depth of possibilities and just like simple musical subjects. And as you can see on screen, this is actually Bach's manuscript, and it breaks off abruptly in the middle section, leaving just the outer line of this fugue to continue. Now, interestingly, this bit of writing, this scribble down here, this is an autograph carrying a note in the handwriting of CPE Bach, and he writes something to the effect of, at the point where the composer introduces the name Bach, in the counter subject to this fugue, the composer died. So have a listen to this unfinished fugue, Contrapunctus 14, and here it is in an arrangement for Baroque ensemble. there is a close-up of C.P. Bach's manuscript. I should say that this is subject to a little bit of dispute. Several Bach scholars hold that Bach wouldn't have been able to write this legibly at such a late stage of his life. Nevertheless, it is somewhat eerie to hear Bach's last major compositional endeavour kind of tail off like that. And this is a common theme. The lack of completion is quite striking when composers just don't get round to putting their pen back to paper. Some musicologists have actually even speculated that this may have been finished, and that brings me to the idea of completion. So there have been multiple attempts at completion, and some include a fourth subject. Now, the idea is that Bach perhaps intended to include the first subject from the very beginning of the work and combine it in this, making it a quadruple fugue. Now, some incorporate this fourth subject, others don't. But here is one that does, transcribed for organ this time by a Hungarian composer called Goncs. You'll hear the moment we just heard, so the transition from Bach to Goncs. And listen out for the BACH just prior to the transition. So BACH is B flat, A, C, and B natural. And on this example, as the piece scrolls through, it's labeled 3. So starting in the last measure of what's on screen at the moment. So initially, it seems quite successful. I mean, you probably wouldn't be able to pinpoint exactly the moment where it stopped being Bach and started being some Hungarian composer that's still alive to this day, unless I'd played you the unfinished version before. But as it proceeds and he tries to incorporate this fourth theme, you're going to hear it get quite thick and quite messy, to the extent that by the time we get towards the end, I don't really think it sounds much like Bach at all. So I'm going to let this roll a bit further. All of the principal themes are labeled, so you can follow along. Watch out for any that's labeled number 4, which is the kind of new addition. So you can see what I mean. You can feel the struggle of trying to bring all these kind of themes to a conclusion. What's noticeable about this, and in fact is common in many of these completions, is just the sheer ambition of it. You know, he's not taking Bach and just kind of adding a cadence at the end and saying, there's my completion. He's extending this like 5 or 6 minutes. He's combining the themes in new ways, adding new sequences. But like I say, is it really Bach? Does it really still sound like Bach? It's hard to say. You can actually find many other different completions of this piece on YouTube. I particularly suggest listening to Glenn Gould's. He does a very interesting thing. He does a kind of big ritenuto at the moment when Bach's music finishes, and then goes on and kind of creates this, this contrapuntal genius in its own right for the rest of them. Death is actually a bit of a common theme when it comes to unfinished works. That's perhaps unsurprising, but none more so than in the case of Mozart's Requiem. I always find it quite remarkable that Mozart's output ended in a Requiem. However, while Bach's Art of the Fugue was only really completed much later in history, it's a different story with Mozart because his contemporaries quickly took it on and completed the work. The version that we're most familiar with was predominantly worked on by Süssmayr and was actually delivered to the person that commissioned it, Count Wolseg, with a counterfeited Mozart signature. Süssmayr's version has actually become so accepted that I would imagine you would be shocked to learn of how little of certain areas of this piece is actually written in Mozart's pen. Listen to this little extract of the very famous Lacrimosa. And in this performance, they limit it to only what Mozart actually wrote down. That is it. That is all Mozart actually wrote of that Lacrimosa. It literally cuts off exactly then. And this performance, again, you can find it on YouTube. It's really quite interesting. They play just the fragments, obviously, that he wrote. But even in the earlier part of it, they play the orchestration that he left. So you get this really pared back, quite spooky Requiem, and very striking with these kind of like endings, rather haunting, really. The Amen fragment, as this performance continues, is intended for the end of this section and is just another striking example of that. So having heard the piece with only what Mozart himself wrote, when you go back to the completed version, you start to notice a few things, especially that there's quite a lot of repetition, which is quite understandable, because if I was left with completing work by Mozart, I would probably use quite a lot of repetition as well. But listening to the later parts of the Requiem, you can detect a slight decrease in originality and quality, although other sections are really successful, like the rest of the Lacrimosa being a good example. What's interesting, because this is a contemporary completion, is that Süssmayr actually did spend quite a bit of time with Mozart prior to his death. So there's a strong possibility that Mozart maybe had some influence over some of the rest of the piece that we're unable to detect just by looking at manuscripts alone. That's one of the kind of greater mysteries when contemporaries finish on the spot. To Schubert, I'm sure when many of you saw the title of this, you probably thought of this work off the bat. It's perhaps the most famous unfinished work, despite the fact that Schubert lived for about 6 years after completing the first 2 movements. So on screen, this is the first page of the orchestrated scherzo, the 3rd movement. And this was almost fully completed in piano's score. He kind of gave up after a few pages of writing it out for orchestra. There are numerous theories about why this work wasn't completed. Most center on Schubert's health and or perhaps his distraction with other works. Shortly after composing this, he went off to work on the Wander Fantasy, which is a huge piano piece. But there's also another theory, which is this triple meter theory. You have the first movement in 3/4, you have the second movement in 3/8, and then this movement, which presumably was intended to be 3/4 as well. That would be almost completely unprecedented in symphonies, to have 3 movements all in 3. And it's possible that this led to a kind of lack of inspiration. However, that this picture and this manuscript exists shows that Schubert clearly thought it was unfinished. Maybe there are justifications for trying to complete what he did. As the 2-movement work, we know this has become really much loved. Modern attempts do exist to complete it. Some align with Schubert's sketches. For me, however, most of them kind of fall flat. Maybe it's just that Schubert had nothing left to say. However, enter Huawei. So I'm not going to say anything other than Huawei was apparently so confident in their phone's AI that it commissioned it to complete Schubert's work. Have a listen. I hope we're all thinking pretty much the same thing, which is that doesn't sound much like Schubert. In fact, I think it's pretty awful, really. Much more about impact over any kind of substance. It was really a big PR exercise for Huawei. And in fact, when you look at their process of how they kind of trained the AR to try and complete this, it was pretty sketchy. They played it just a few themes from earlier in the symphony, and then I presume there must have been some kind of basic theory behind it. But the result, sounds more like a film score than something that you could imagine with the early movements. I think AI really is all about process, and obviously the processing power is crazy in this new technology. And perhaps there is an answer when it can be harnessed correctly. In the case of Beethoven's 10th Symphony, which we'll talk about in a moment, musicians in Germany are actively training AI to pick and predict what Beethoven would have written. So their process is they play fragments of Beethoven, they let the AI try and complete them, and then they play the correct version back with the idea that the computer, it's so weird, you end up using these personified way of talking about these things. The idea that the computer learns what the right answer is. Now, obviously, Beethoven's an incredibly unpredictable composer, but that's definitely a much more sophisticated way of doing it. And although the final orchestrated version is not yet available, it will be quite interesting to hear the final result, I think. So, Beethoven's 10th Symphony. Beethoven left particularly tantalizing hints for his 10th Symphony, and this is definitely a work that would have changed the history of classical music had it kind of come to fruition. Now, the professor I worked most closely with during my time in Manchester was actually the first musicologist to attempt to completion. This was back in 1988 or something. So I would like to play you a short video so that you can glimpse his creative process and the kind of fragments that he was working with.
All the sketches I've found are very short, none more than about 20 or 30 bars at the most, sometimes a lot shorter than that. And so it was rather like having a lot of pieces for a jigsaw puzzle, trying to put them into the right positions. My job has been to try and work out what he intended to write and what he had in mind at the time. And so from that point of view, a lot of the harmony and so on will be mine, but it'll be mine having worked out what he probably would have done. All the inspiration is Beethoven's, and the basic shape of the movement is Beethoven's as far as I can tell. There's a sketch here for part of the first movement, and it says horns. And then after that there's the main theme. And it just says etc. after that, but we can get the next bit from a different sketch. And then you get to the fast section, which is here. So from there, you've got to build up a long, slow introduction, which, as you get from other sketches. And so you have to harmonize them as well. So you have your horns still stay, and you have the tune harmonized. Some of the harmony I've had to make up on the basis of what Beethoven normally did and what sounds right. Some of it is actually in the sketches. As regards the instrumentation for that bit, another sketch indicates that that has to be played by the woodwind, so we can get the instrumentation, unaccompanied woodwind. And then we have the main theme, which I have to harmonize, and again, there's some of that harmony is in the sketches already. I have to add a little trill there. Originally it's just that, but it's just the sort of place where Beethoven put in a trill in the final version.
So Barry is clearly taking some liberties here, and he did take some criticism at the time for doing so. Personally, I find his ability to really kind of live with the composer through these sketches quite astonishing. You can literally put any Beethoven sketch in front of him, and he'll be able to do that. Basically read it as if it was like a piece of regular manuscript. It's like quite remarkable, because Beethoven sketches are incredibly difficult to read, like really scrappy. And often on just a single piece of paper, you'll have multiple ideas for different pieces. So let's take that little introduction and actually listen to what his final version was, what he thought Beethoven 10 would actually sound like. So it might not be the most strikingly original, but it definitely sounds like Beethoven. You would easily listen to that and kind of recognize it as being of the style. The question is really, is there enough to fill out a whole symphony? Barry decided no, restricts himself to the first movement. But a tantalizing like little glimpse into what might have come next had Beethoven lived a little longer. So far, the examples have been among the most famous, but these unfinished fragmentary works extend far beyond just like the first Viennese school. One of my favorites is actually the reconstruction of the Elgar Piano Concerto. Now, Elgar worked on his piano concerto for almost 20 years. He references it multiple times in letters, often actually alongside talking about the cello concerto at the same time, kind of like sister projects, basically. Now, there is a 2-piano reduction of the second movement, but composer Robert Walker extended this through the use of numerous other sketches and listening to some of Elgar's own improvisations into a 36-minute, 3-movement concerto. Walker is an Elgar fanatic. He even went as far as to refurbish and live in one of Elgar's old houses. And it kind of shows in his music and his humility. He has a real kind of like sense of what the composer would have written, as will be apparent in this short extract of music. It's just a big Elgar tune. You'll be transported there straight away. I've also included some of his remarks, which I think are notable for his respect for the composer.
When I first was worrying about what to call it, I didn't want to call it Elgar's Piano Concerto because I thought that was a little presumptuous. People have persuaded me otherwise, but originally I wanted to call it Fragments of Elgar. And in a way, that's exactly what it is. It's fragments of this great composer's work of his very last period, which I'm sure needs to be heard. It's good enough to have an airing, rather than just sit in the British Museum in drawers. And so what I've done, I hope, is given it a life.
So there's actually a full, absolutely fascinating 45-minute interview online with Walker and the pianist for the premiere, David O. Norris, describing the complete process and describing the decisions behind every kind of like each of the three movements. It really is very interesting to hear how he puts it together, and the bits that are his, how he works out to invert a certain theme to fit it with one that came earlier and things like that. Now, there are many, many more examples that I could have explored in more detail, but for the brief nature of this presentation, I'll walk you through just a few. Elgar also left massive sketches, almost 130 pages, for his third symphony. He even said to his doctor that if I can't complete the third symphony, then somebody will complete it for me. Eventually, Anthony Payne was commissioned by Elgar's family to complete the work. His version has actually been performed all over the world. It's almost gained a place in the repertoire. Opera also has a place in the story. Puccini left Turandot unfinished at his death. He got roughly up to the final duet with detailed sketches left of the rest. There was much controversy about who would finish this work. During the premiere, Toscanini actually stopped conducting at the point where Puccini had, I guess, died, and stated to the audience at the Scala words to the effect of, "Here the maestro laid down his pen." It's kind of a mess, really, a vast tangle of possible endings to Turandot. Puccini's son wanted one person to complete it. Puccini left instructions for someone else to complete it. Toscanini had a big input, cutting sections. So really the result is that productions are left to their own devices to decide which ending they want when they put this opera on. Sibelius 8 and Tchaikovsky 7, both of those were abandoned by the composers during their lifetime. Sibelius 8 is actually probably one of the greatest losses of all. The composer wasn't happy with it and apparently threw it into the fire. But I mean, what a shame. An extra Sibelius symphony would be wonderful. And Tchaikovsky 7 has been reassembled by Bogutyrev, who's a Russian composer. But it's very unconvincing because Tchaikovsky himself kind of rehashed the material. He siphoned off quite a lot that went into his third piano concerto, which is a one-movement short work. So when he's using the material in other places, I don't think it has quite the same impact. Mahler 10, now that's a really fascinating case. His drafts and sketches for that comprise 72 pages of full score, 50 pages of continuous short score, and then 44 pages of drafts. And he even left a form, a 5-movement form. So there's a chap called Derek Cook who completed that work with the blessing of the family and was successful enough for the work to be performed by many of the world's best orchestras. In fact, the first recording was in 1966 by the Philadelphia Orchestra under Ormandy. In fact, that's the same for Tchaikovsky. 4 years earlier, the first recording of Tchaikovsky 7 was also Philadelphia Orchestra under Ormandy. Finally, that brings us to Bruckner 9. So Bruckner 9 is already an hour long and was normally played with just its completed 3 movements, but it does have an unfinished 4th movement. Now, there is a sketch for it. I could tell you all about it, but there is someone that is probably even more qualified, as the finale of Bruckner 4th was recently completed by Rattle and the Berlin Phil and a team of musicologists. So have a listen to what they managed to achieve with the finale of Bruckner 9.
After all these years, it's really extraordinary to be playing the Bruckner Ninth Symphony with a finale. And to understand why we do it and what this finale is, we have to go quite far back into history. In the 1890s, when Bruckner was writing his Ninth Symphony, he was not in good health either, physically or psychologically. But at the same time, he was writing transcendent music and writing music in a new voice and a new language, more revolutionary and more extreme than he'd ever written before. There's a kind of myth that there are only sketches left of the last movement. In fact, there was really an emerging full score there, complete almost to the end. Now, to understand the way Bruckner works, you have to think in terms of an architect as much as a composer. As far as I know, he's the only composer who would decide on the length of his movement and then simply put all the bars on manuscript, not only numbered, but also numbered in phrase lengths before any note was in there. So it's like the blueprint of a great cathedral. And just to give you an idea, if there are about 650 bars in the finale, 600 are clearly written by Bruckner. And these four wonderful musicians who worked on the finale for so many years said at the end they had to compose only 28 bars using material that was already there.
It's only 28 measures. 28 measures away from finishing his Ninth Symphony as he would have wanted. You may have heard of the curse of the Ninth. Schoenberg had this to say about Ninth Symphonies. Seems that the Ninth is a limit. He who wants to go beyond it must pass away. It seems as if something might be imparted to us in the 10th, which we ought not yet to know, for which we are not ready. Those who have written a Ninth stood too close to the hereafter. There you go, incomplete works for you. That pretty much wraps up a brief survey of them. What have we learnt? And certainly that unfinished works are incredibly prevalent. They're often left as a result of death, but also due to abandonment or other issues. Definitely learnt that convincing reconstructions can be made, and that the more material is left behind, the easier it is to fill in the blanks. I hope you agree with me that artists are still probably best placed to make these efforts, although the development of technology may challenge them soon. If AI is capable of using the entirety of music history to complete a work, what chance do we have in the end? But perhaps most importantly, while we will never know how composers will complete this music themselves, there is enough material in the sketches for both musical fulfillment and musicological interest. I mean, in the words of Robert Walker, who you heard earlier, work which needs to be heard, too good to sit in a museum in drawers.